Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today, I'm honoured to be speaking with Head of Sports Psychology and Personal Development at Nottingham Forest Football Club, Jennifer Lace. Jennifer, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hi Dan, thanks for having me.
I think what we'll do is we'll start by getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience.
Okay, I'm Jenny. I'm new into a new club at Nottingham Forest Football Club, where I've taken on a new role, as you've just said there, of Head of Sports Psychology and Personal Development. Worked at Burnley Football Club previously to this, done the bases route, done an undergrad, done a MSc at Stafford. Worked in a couple of different sports, but predominantly football.
And I know you're going through the process of becoming what we call in the UK HCPC registered, and HCPC, for everybody who doesn't know, which I would imagine is 99% of the audience, is the Health and Care Professions Council. So you can become a fully registered sports psychologist. And I think what would be really, really cool would be sort of taking the audience through, because you know what, now I think about this, I actually haven't done this on the Sports Psych Show, Jennifer, and I think you're the ideal person to do this. Take us through the process of becoming a sports psychologist. Where do you start? You know, what degrees does one do? Then what does you said about bases, and what's that, and what's HCPC? Take us through the whole process.
Right, okay, so it's changing, an ever-changing landscape in this year. There's been some big movements in how you can become a sports psych, but you would typically do a undergraduate degree in sport and exercise psychology, which is a BPS, so it's British Psychological Society accredited degree. Then you would typically go and do a master's degree, again a British Association of Sport and a BPS degree.
Yeah, British Psychological Society, yep.
And then you can then go on and do a supervised experience, which then allows you to become, or you apply then for HCPC register, which is Healthcare Professionals Register. Now you have also got a kind of parallel body to work with, which is the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science, which is BASES. Similar process whereby it's supervised experience. There are a couple of other routes via direct application, but my first undergraduate degree was British Psychological Society, and then I went on and had a postgrad diploma next, which was BASES accredited. So I had a real switch between the two, where I kind of was thinking I can't go any further with the British Psychological Society because my master's then wasn't in line with their route, but then my kind of postgrad diploma was BASES, so I really switched for a couple of years on how I was going to progress. But yeah, you can work now with both. So BASES, I know, have recently developed a pathway. Some of the guys who are in our industry have worked really hard to be able to develop that training route so that you can then apply for HCPC as well.
So in super simple terms, it's a 3-year degree in either psychology or sports psychology, and that sports psychology has to be accredited with a governing body, essentially. You then got a master's degree, and then once you've done that, you move on to supervision. So we're talking about a sort of somewhere in between a 5 to 7 year process, or 6 to 8 year process, something like that.
Yeah. And to be fair, I graduated in 2009 or 10 for my undergrad. And even kind of 10 years later, I'm still feeling like every single week you need to learn more. And you say, oh, this is new. You go off on that way. So it's actually, I don't think you ever stop the process.
What's been the most profound experience in that? Well, you said 10-year, 15-year journey. What for you along that journey? What's been the most profound experience?
So maybe 3 seasons ago now, at Burnley, they got a new head of coaching, and he, on his first day, so I sat on the sports science team, worked with the players, and we kind of know that on the peripheral, or a couple of years ago on the peripheral, you knew that you had to work with coaches to get some impact on building the culture and so on. And on his first day, he came straight up to me and said, I want you on my team. Now, there was only me at the time at at Burnley, so it wasn't a case that we had multiple sports psychs to have an impact across everybody that was needed. And he said, yeah, I want you to come and work on the coaches team, and we're going to change the job description. It'll just be the coaches. Do you think you can do it? And I knew deep down that that's where you have most impact, but I'd never been formally put in that position. It was always been predominantly player facing, as I've just said. And I remember saying, yeah. And then I was thinking, oh God, I'm actually not that sure. And I think for the first year of doing that role with that scope, I was thinking I was so out of my depth, because the skill of, although the knowledge base is the same or is similar, and there's a lot of crossovers, the skill of working with a coach, and so we had ex-professional players and ex-international players on our coaching team. I've never played the game. I don't really understand the game. So yeah, for the first year, I was thinking this is a totally different skill in a totally different landscape. So I really had to change the reading that I read or add things in, the people that I networked with, and learned a little bit broader than kind of just being intervention-led conversations. Kind of 3 years later, I'm not saying I'm fantastic at it, but I have a lot more confidence now to kind of operate in the coach ed scope and areas rather than just player facing.
So backtracking a bit here, up until that point, you had just been what you describe as player facing. So your previous club, Burnley, had brought you in, and you were essentially working with players individually and in groups.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. And so the big boss comes along and says, hey, we need you with our coaches. And what was, obviously, as you said, that struck a little bit of fear into you, because it was alien to you. Players with a wealth of experience who are now embarking on coaching careers. Where did you, and I suppose tapping into your memory here, where did you start? Do you remember the first few sessions? How did you go about beginning that process?
So the first couple of sessions, I knew some of the coaches anyway, because I've been there for maybe 4 or 5 years at this point. But I just started right from the beginning, kind of as if I was new, introducing the scope of the role individually, getting to know. And this is where the personal development comes in, and we talk about looking after our players as people as well. But it's exactly the same approach with coaches. So we wanted to know who were they as coaches, what was their style, what did they bring to the session, and then where did that come from? How could we really harness that? So I was quite lucky that my previous academy manager had seen a model at a Premier League conference that he liked, and he was kind of like, I don't know how we'd live it, but I love what it stands for. And it was a relationship-based model that he'd seen. So he basically was like, can we bring this alive? Which obviously from a psychological perspective, where you're looking at building relationships, that was great. And it gave me a real kind of guide to start the conversations. So for the first year or so, we used that model, and we just identified some of the behaviours from the model in practice, which gave you a little bit of scope to open up the conversations then. And then you can obviously develop your conversations a little bit deeper and further, and get a little bit creative with who they are and how they can bring that to the session in line with the model. Yeah, so I was quite lucky to have that model. And personally, I didn't know a great deal about it before. I knew of it, but I didn't know about it. I then went on to do an MSc at Stafford. Mm-hmm. And I used the model in my dissertation in our coach development programme.
Take us through that model, Jennifer.
So I know it is heavily criticised by some people, but we used the transformational leadership model.
Okay.
And the reason why was it gave us a good breakdown of descriptors, and as I say, the academy manager had seen it. It was digestible for the coaches. So I worked in coach ed for probably 3 years, and we stuck with that model. But obviously coming out the other end, you think as a practitioner, might use this, could have used that. Matt Slater at Stafford was my master's dissertation advisor, and obviously he's big on his leadership of social identity. But for me to do my dissertation and kind of argue why transformational leadership was the best one, I had to critique maths as well, and it was just but it was good. And I learned so much about the different leadership models as well, and that process really helped me kind of say, well, actually in future maybe we would or we wouldn't use this. Or I do like it because it does, the coaches the descriptors of each of the kind of, there's 5 I's in that model around influence, individualization, how do we motivate people, how do we adapt individually for people, and then how do we reflect. It gives you so Jean Cote and Jen Turnage, who are developing this model in sport, they give you little descriptors of each of them. So that was really helpful and really understandable for the coaches, which obviously gave us a good in then to get in there and develop further how we wanted our coaches to be.
It would be really cool to dig a little bit deeper here. Transformational leadership, 5 I's. Influence, individual, I think you said. I'll tell you what, let's start with influence. Take us through that if you can.
So we are just looking at how do they, in its broad sense, how do our coaches influence our players? In its broad sense, you're looking at how do they influence the players. Now, if you say that to a coach, they can register that and they start to think about it. So if you take it back a little bit and come a bit more broad, if we say, guys, we're looking at how you build relationships with the players, a lot of it is they think they're doing these things or they try to do these things. It's not really a systematic way, or I know as humans we like labels, but it is easier to have conversations when you have some categories. So the influence, for example, you then dig a little bit deeper and say, how are you influencing our players? And they have a little think, and then we go further and giving them some of the breakdowns from, as I say, the Cote and Turnage research, which is looking at how do they discuss pro-social values or behaviours. So doing what is right rather than what is convenient. How do they show humility? Do they recognise the mistakes? How do they share experiences with others? That was probably one of my favourites to work on. And this is where you can really get into who the coach is as a person. So I'll share an example with you of a coach on this specific construct for sharing experience with others. This coach, he was a part-time coach, and he is ex-military, and so he's been in the parachute regiments. That was his whole kind of life. And we then obviously he was a coach at the club for years, brilliant coach, but really focused on the session and thought, okay, I need to come in, deliver the best football session and learn all the technical, tactical aspects of the game and then come out. And then obviously we go in, me and our head of coaching, and start asking questions around, okay, how can you then bring your previous experiences to our players? How can you share times when maybe you've been stressed or when you've been under pressure and pass that on to our players? And at first it was really alien to him, but actually what we got was one of his key times in his life where he thought, oh my god, this is a massive deal to me, was his first parachute jump when he turned 16. So we were encouraging him then to share that experience and showing that humility, that he was really vulnerable at that time and his thoughts and feelings to our younger players. So that was kind of like one of his psych targets, was to think about how he may share them experience or that specific experience in the session. And obviously I'd structured when the coaches have check-ins and how many they had. I think off the top of my head, I think it was 2 to 3 formal, like we developed their psych plans. And we came to doing his again, but just before I was going to do his that week, he pulled me a couple of days earlier and said, Jen, look what I've brought in for the players. And out of his bag he pulled one of his first photographs from his skydive, his first parajump. And he says, I'm going to show this to the boys tonight. And the look on his face on the photo was terrifying. It screamed anxiety, it screamed stress, it screamed every stress response you could think of. And actually, we didn't change his psych plan at that time because he was still processing and getting confident and sharing his own experiences with our players. So it was kind of, that's how we tried to embed it into practice. Then yes, it's great to teach all the technicalities, but if we had a 2-minute conversation at the start of the session around sharing our experiences and showing when we were vulnerable and showing humility, and for that example, picking out a photograph of when that coach was 16 and saying, boys, this was me at this time, they were the kind of how we made the model come alive.
As you're speaking there, I mean, I know this, but it really does emphasize how coaches' personalities, beliefs, attitudes towards, well, the beliefs and attitudes towards coaching and the personalities they bring to the table, influence their coaching culture, their coaching practice, their coaching processes, and just engaging in that process of helping them, I suppose, helping them become aware of themselves, but also opening up a different world. And that world being that coaching isn't just about the X's, the O's, the tact, physical, that it is about engaging players, helping them learn the psychosocial sides of things. It's such a great story that you've given there, and it's just made me think about just personality, attitude, beliefs of coaches.
Absolutely, and I think I'm not a football fan, but I think I do support Burnley after working there for so long. It's like my first big club. It's just odd for a Scouser to say that they support Burnley, I know. And there's loads of great things that was coming out of there by the time I left. I think one of the things is the manager is really big on relationships and looking after people, and a real humanistic approach to some of our key times, that being the first team manager, and that really transcended. So the culture that was being built in the academy when I left, we worked on it really hard for the year or so before I left as well, was around getting the kids to love the game, and the coach loves the kid. And that was always a kind of saying that we constantly spoke about. Relationships, our biggest competitors are Man United, Man City, Liverpool and Everton. If you're talking radius, we're never going to have the facilities or the infrastructure to provide the same experience in them capacities as our biggest rivals. So it was really about how can we make people feel welcome, how can we, and it worked. I sat with a player once, and he come from one of them bigger clubs around us, and he said to me, so randomly, said to me one day, "I love it here." And I was like, "Oh, why?" And he says, "Everyone knows your name. Everyone asks about how your school's been." And you think, you can't pay anybody to say that. It's not a formal, professionalized kind of interview. It was just merely that's how he felt at the time. So you think, okay, as much as you look at constructs in a grid and think, okay, we're going to work on that, how can we develop that with that coach? How can we get into show a little bit more in considering our ex-players, or how can we get into flex a bit more? You actually see the results in how people feel. If that makes sense.
I hear relationship as an edge when confronted with bigger clubs in the vicinity. What I personally love about what you've said, and going back a few minutes to this notion of framework to build relationship, I think that a lot of people balk at that idea. A lot of people think of that being inauthentic or artificial, that somehow a coach should instantly be able to establish rapport, build relationships. But number one, that's not always easy to do. Number two, that's not always natural for people to do. So I love that notion of framework, and going back to some of the things you said, helping coaches have a relationship framework around talking around pro-social values, humility, sharing experiences. What other, we've probably crossed I's, but there's influence. Are there any other I's in that model that perhaps we haven't touched upon?
We've got about expressing confidence and player potential. Was something else that we looked at.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a bit about that.
So it's quite easy to always talk to the same players all the time and to say the same players' names, and it's that typical how many times do you say well done versus you need to run more or you need to get in here. We looked at in the same kind of construct, how do we then challenge the players in not only exceeding our expectations but also just meeting them. When do we give that well done? When do we give that praise? When do we really give them and show that we are confident that they can develop and that they've got it in them? Quite often we say, guys, we're going to do this, we are going to do this, but when do we actually ever say we could go on and do XYZ, or individually you could be like such a player? And you see, if you say them comments individually to a player, you see the kind of peacock feathers come out, the shoulders are up, the players go, oh, he's talking to me, I can really be that person. So again, it looks like so easy words on a page, but we don't really live them as much when we start to really kind of look through the behaviours that are actually going on. And it's not, I'm not kind of saying it's the coach's fault, but there's a lot to think about. I've never been a coach, and it's one thing that I always try and think about and say to the coaches, I don't know what it's like to design a session. I could have a little go. You know, I've taught a little bit. I have been in sport, but I don't actually know what it's like to command a group of 20 footballers and then have somebody dump a load of psych constructs on top of me as well. So I'm not saying that they're deliberately not doing it, or that they're poor because they're not doing it, but I think sometimes it's just habit and having things on their conscience. So yeah, expressing that confidence in player potential seems a given, but actually in reality on a training night or a training session, there's so much going on with so many different people. Things are easy to forget or just slip.
I think it's a really pertinent point. I think I can be guilty of this. I think we in sports psychology can be guilty of this, and maybe sports science can be guilty of this, is that forgetting that coaches do still need to have a knowledge base on the tech side of the game. And then we come along and start delivering our wares, as you describe our constructs, and make coaching appear more complicated, and that can be overwhelming. And this is where coaches need a great deal of support, don't they? And again, I come back to that's where I think a framework is so useful, to be able to introduce a model, maybe a framework or a bunch of frameworks within that model. It helps coaches to compartmentalize things. That's what it feels like it does.
Yeah, and although we use a framework, our whole Coach Ed program was individualized to the coach. And that was a hard thing for people to get, although the head of coaching conveyed how he wanted it to be to me quite simply, and I really bought into what he was trying to create. People like Audit, people who wanted to see our program, it's not a tick box. They all had an individual psych development plan, which was, it kind of went off these 4 or 5 titles, but then the content within each of them looked so different because it was specific to them. As I say, if we didn't want, with the coach with the parachute picture, we didn't just redo his psych program because it was the second cycle of the season. We left him because he was in that moment still embracing that specific one. So we didn't, consideration for part-time staff, consideration for where he is on his football learning journey, his confidence journey. Things were changing. It was really, really individualised. Some people went off onto one went to a research school in Blackpool because that was something that he needed for his coaching. It linked into a title in some way, a construct in some way, but actually everybody's was so different. It really worked. It was, and as I say, when Order came in, they're like, so everyone's doing something different, but you use these 5 titles, and how's this working? But yeah, we spent hours making psych plans, which is, the discussions. I know my previous head of coaching won't mind me saying this, and I think it's quite common knowledge, but I've done 2 coaches drastically different of each other. One really kind of saying to me weekly, Jen, what's new? Jen, how do we do this? Jen, I was thinking about this. Saturday evening would text me. I said, I was thinking about this with this group today. And then I had another coach that didn't breathe a word of psych. I didn't breathe a word of technical knowledge. He didn't breathe a word of any personal experiences in the environment. I didn't know anything from playing. He was an ex-player. And that was a real challenge because I was thinking over and over, how am I going to attack this? How am I going to have an impact and get this relationship working? Because personally, we don't really have a lot in common. Professionally, we, other than both being in the same building, he was so data, he was so, the technicalities of his focuses and he will admit himself, like obsessive. So that was a totally different angle that I had to take. And we got there, and that was probably my biggest in terms of coach achievement, where I was actually able to get into his thoughts in the first place, have an angle, and then obviously build on them a little bit more. So totally different for everybody, but just with this really loose guided, like you're saying, compartmentalized framework.
What if you don't mind me asking, what did you do? What angle did you take with this coach? Because I think this is a really interesting conversation to have, because different coaches have different needs, as you explained, needs, wants, doubts, experiences, etc., and personalities, and attitudes towards certain things. So how did you combat this?
I spent quite a lot of time just being around him. So one evening, my previous club had a huge indoor pitch, so he was just watching another session. So I was just sat next to him and I was just talking to him, and I'd done this 2 or 3 times, but I hadn't really got anything substantial that I could really go, okay, I see that. Obviously you understand people a little bit, but I hadn't really gained insight to who he was as a person. He wasn't giving me anything about his playing career, but I knew that he was good, because good people gravitate to good people as well. And I knew a lot of people at the club loved working with him. I knew the boys loved working with him as well. And that's another angle to what you're saying. If somebody's doing something that's already working and the boys already love that coach, how do you then get in to say, oh, but you could be even better by trying this, or see if this does make you even better? So it was really difficult. And one night I was sitting on the indoor just next to him. I didn't have a clue what was going on in the under 12 session that we were supposed to be watching, I'm not going to lie to you. And he was just next to me, and he said about his favourite player was I think it's a centre mid called Zabi. Is that right?
Yep.
X-A, yeah. And then it made sense to me, because even with my lack of football knowledge and my lack of player knowledge, I know that he was really known for scanning lots and lots of times, for being a real technical player. And actually just that one little piece almost painted me a bigger picture of who this coach was. So then we got talking about, okay, the types of things that this coach does at home. And he was so football obsessed, and so obsessive over the tiny details, that actually the approach I ended up taking was, I'm not going to be able to influence him the same as the other people. So what I need to get him to do, and when I'd watch sessions as well, was understand why he did the things he did. So we used, and some people might like it, some people don't, and it's the first time I'd used it within a session, a frame of reference. So it wasn't me trying to then add to his session. It was almost me saying, I just want you to think about from your playing days why you do some of the things you do with the boys, and here's a bit of a tool, this frame of reference. Have you ever seen it? Do you know about it? Here's what it may be. I know you reflect in the car because that's your time. Maybe could you do it in this kind of way? And actually that straight away builds you some professional credibility, because they go, oh, never seen that before, that's new, okay, that's a little bit of knowledge. So you get some professional gains there. And then they start, or he specifically came back to me maybe a week or so later and said, Jen, I was thinking about that frame of reference that you said, and he'd been an ex-player at Preston, and he said, then I've realised one of the things that I do with our boys is this, and it's because when I was at Preston, that's what worked with me. So then you can then build on the what's in his coaching, rather than coming in and kind of saying, we were watching your coaching video and we were wondering how you influence the play, because he's like, I don't influence the players, or I give them more technical knowledge, that's how I influence the players. So it was different, and it was, for me as a practitioner, I thought over and over, where's my in? How can I understand this coach? Well, I couldn't, because we didn't speak the same language in terms of psych and technical. We were probably bipolar opposites of the spectrum. And then second, how do I get to know this person then? Because I need something to see what's behind the coach that presents itself. That makes sense?
Absolutely. You talk about a frame of reference. What do you mean by that? What process did you have him go through?
So a frame of reference is it's a counselling framework, and it's basically understanding how your experiences and your values then interpret what you see. So it kind of looks at, say, use this player for example. What experience has he had at Preston that makes him then conduct the same behaviours or thoughts in our environment or in another environment? So it's really exploring the perspective that he's then wearing, or it's like a coaching lens that he's coming into our environment with. If a player says he's injured, this coach has a previous experience of himself being injured and therefore assumes that this player's is the same. So it is literally, we are looking at somebody's perspective on things and understanding that not everybody's world is the same as yours.
So you asked the coach to reflect back on his playing, his training, and reference that with regard what he does now in his training session.
Absolutely, yes. So to see if we could identify any kind of bias in his understanding and judgments of things. And
so the reason you did that, I suppose you've just outlined it in many respects, but you wanted him on his car journey home, not just to reflect back on what he saw, what he experienced during the present session, but to compare and contrast what he experienced in his playing career, his training, and start to appreciate maybe where his coaching approach came from, why he sees the world, the footballing world he sees.
Absolutely, yeah. And then I think the reason why that worked is because then he brought to me a set of things. This is what I do and this is why, rather than me trying to top up what he was already doing or trying to influence what he was already doing and saying, can we try these things? So it was kind of a bottom-up approach from the coach for me to then say, okay, let's work on, or shall we manipulate some of these things that you're maybe doing, and just see the effects and see if there has any changes or any impact if we do change these things. So again, it was probably more driven by him than it was us. And then my challenge was to see if any of the things that he brought could fit into our framework, our kind of 5 eyes. So it was really not, it wasn't that everybody had to specifically follow the 5 eyes, but they are quite broad, and most of the things. So for example, one thing that he did was, it didn't ask many questions because he was so full of energy as personality, and he was so kind of fast processing as a person, and he would come in the building and he would be bubbly and he'd be bright, and his sessions were moving really fast, which is great for some people. But obviously taking that little moment to ask a question and be silent when you've asked the question didn't come naturally to him. So he brought to me, actually, I don't really ask questions, and I've realised the reason why that may be is because during my career as a player, that was never done to me in the session. Okay, well, shall we challenge that? Shall we try it? How would it feel for you to do it? And actually then, asking the questions does then fit in to our intellectual stimulation in our transformational leadership model, because it talks about emphasising the learning process and how can we check learning. So it kind of all fits in the broad sense. We're not trying to kind of, you can only work on these 5 eyes and that's it. It's really just, as we say, a guiding framework for discussion, yeah.
So what I hear in terms of your experiences at Burnley, it started as a sports psychologist from an isolated perspective in many respects. Player-facing, individuals, groups. Then a new head of coaching came in and said, no, I want this integrated. There was a shift towards integration, and that shift towards integration was you being immersed in the coaching staff. I hear that a model was put in place, transformational leadership, with a framework, those 5 eyes. So those kind of going hand in hand. I hear that model, that framework, and the directive from the coach, the head of coaching, was, I want my coaches to grow. I want them to know themselves as people, as professionals, and that builds a platform for communication and subsequent growth. Would that be a neat summary of your time at Burnley?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, by the time I left, we were looking at how do we build an environment and a culture that is different from our main competitors. Yeah.
I love it. And so New beginnings, new openings. A new doorway opens to Nottingham Forest Football Club, where you are now. Another ginormous team in the Midlands in England. Tell me a little bit about that, and obviously appreciative of what you can and you can't say, but you started there back in December, end of 2019, so you're fairly new. So there's only so much you can say, but what's your thoughts going in there and new tasks, what have you?
Well, yes, I'm really privileged to join Forest. Now they've had somebody consultancy in the role previous to me for a couple of years on and off. I think they've had one or two people, some really good people in the industry that I know of at now other clubs and with some big organisations. So they've had some sports psych. But like any role, you want to do it differently. You know, my lens is absolutely getting stuck into the coaches and what we see on the grass, and I'm really quite interested in kind of how we structure our practices as well, and not just player facing. And I think just the nature of sometimes when you are consultancy, you miss things. I've done it where I've been part time. You're chasing your tail just because you're not there all the time. You do get people throw stuff at you when you come in and say, "Can you just work with that player? They've done this," and actually, you're never able to build something strategic on the time that you've got. So, my approach was I kind of was seeing who the people were, how it worked, what we had, which was some good stuff being delivered before, but by nature, you know, I wanted to change some things as well. So I had to firefight a little bit early on when I joined and say, I'm not going to sit in that meeting because the perception of psych was going to be different from now on, or, you know, I need to build as well. As a head of a department now, responsible for all of the phases, I'm trying to think about where priorities lie, and priorities maybe are different at this club than were at my previous club for different reasons. So that's me trying to understand the culture here. That's a definite challenge because you get so programmed. I was at Burnley for 8 or 9 years by the time I left, and you get so programmed to how we worked, and here it is different. So there's that. People who maybe listen to this may know, coming away from player facing work in the last 2 or 3 years before leaving, I wasn't going to be naive enough to think that I knew everything about working with players when I've gone into a role where initially they want player facing stuff because nobody's done it, so you do need to fill them shoes. So there's a couple of key things. So like homesickness is a big one for us. Now when I started Burnley, when I was like 21, homesickness presented itself really frequently. And I think I worked at that for the first 2-3 years quite significantly. Obviously, then you go into a kind of coach head role, you step away from that, and then coming back into Forest, it presents itself again. So my first thought was, who is the best at the moment, or who can I really go and learn and speak to before I make any moves on how the psych department is going to run, almost to top up my own knowledge as well. So I did that for our key kind of psych principles. So psych of injury was another one that I felt like, you know, it's on the peripheral of your reading, but working so heavily in coach ed, my contacts and my reading was around executive coaching and navigating conversations. I know you've had Dave Levine on. People like Dave, I was really kind of, Dave will tell you, I think I stalked him whenever, anytime he was in the Northwest. I was like, you know, Dave, are you in? Can we get some time? Can I talk to you about this? So it's a different world that you almost operate in to try and deliver your psych knowledge, which obviously you can't do everything. So I came away from Dr. Adam Gledhill at Leeds. What's Adam's latest movements on his psych of injury? So again, before I've implemented anything here, I wanted to make sure it was going to be right. So I've contacted some key people from different sports, different organisations to say, talk to me about this before I roll out anything. I just want to make sure we can get it right. So it's good because there's nothing strategically in place, but it's challenging because there's nothing strategically in place. And I've come from such a niche role where people knew not so much not to come to you with welfare, because that sounds like you are a cold sports psych and you're not going to deal with welfare. But, you know, 7 years or 8 years ago when I started at Burnley, there was no player care. there was not really much on safeguarding. There was a bit of education and welfare, so everything as a sports psych got thrown to you. And again, you don't have any impact when you're trying to do everything for every player and every staff. So by the time I left, I was in such a niche role where people knew that I was coaches only. I worked at one or two players because I had a good relationship with them from the years that I've been there. And obviously people gravitate to different people, so you're never going to say no because I only work with coaches, but the scope changes. Whereas here, there's no real defined role, which is great, but as I say, it is a challenge for me personally as well.
If we were to wave a magic wand and suddenly we had this football club, but it could be also a basketball organisation. Hey, look, it could be NFL. It could be any big sporting organisation. It could be a big college program in the States. What do you think? I mean, it's fascinating listening to you, Jennifer, because it just demonstrates, and we're talking organisations here rather than just individual athletes, right? The complication and complexity and enormity that one faces when you're dealing with hundreds of people within an organisation. What does, putting you on a spot here, I suppose, what does ideal look like? I mean, as I say, you could take, you work in Premier League, Championship clubs. We're talking soccer, football here, but we could use any sport. What do you think ideal looks like? How many sports psychologists? Are there clinical psychs involved? What does it look like? No money, no objective, which it always is. But let's say money, no objective. What do you think? Let's have some fun here. What's it look like?
So we definitely have clinical psychs. I know there's a new role as well around sports psychiatry. So I've been in contact with, again, me being nosy and wanting to know everything about what everybody's doing in our industry, where that's come from, what that looks like, how's that different from normal psychiatry, and all of the questions that we've got there. So definitely have them. Mental health is a huge one that I think in an ideal we would have. I know player care kind of do this as well, but we would have perfect mental health strategies, because as psych you're trying to focus on performance and you get dragged in a little bit on mental health, which I say dragged in loosely, but me, for example, I love getting into the nooks and crannies of performance. So broader, wider mental health is bigger than one person. So ideally to have a set strategy and a pathway, psychiatry in there, clinical psych as well in there. I think you'd have specialists for different things as well. I think an area that we massively overlook, well, two areas, and I'm not saying this is in either clubs, by the way, but just in terms of youth development, not football related, just human youth development, is the idea of sexual orientation and transgender, learning difficulties, and I forgot the other one that I was going to say to you. Eating disorders or eating behaviours. They're the things that actually I think present themselves quite a bit in our environment, and we don't have the specialists around us to be able to do it. You don't go to many of the sport specific conferences and they have these people presenting. I know there's some really good people out there. I'm not that naive to it, but that would be the ideal, that we have almost like you have an individualized coach for the technical things, that the footballness is what I call it, the stuff that I don't understand too much. We would have the same for psych. It'd be unbelievable to have the way you have kind of learning and development people in. So I was on a recent webinar with the Doncaster Chamber of Commerce, and they were brilliant, and they had somebody who was working just purely in learning and development. I teach a day a week back at the Etihad, and we're getting some direction from Bucks New University, and they have a learning technologist. So somebody who's there developing the online programs, developing how that would be awesome for us in the game to have these resources to be as creative as we can with psych as well.
And to reverse the question, what if somebody was sitting near us and overheard our conversation and said, Dan, Jennifer, calm down. the girls, the boys, it's just soccer, it's just football, it's simple. What would you say to that? Would you have empathy with that? Where do you stand on that notion of, I don't know, I hate to use the term old school simplicity? What's your thoughts on that?
I can empathise. I do believe one of my key beliefs is we are all a support mechanism. So originally, psychology, physio, sports science, analysis, we sit on a scientific support team originally. So, and this is my personal belief and value, and seeing it play out in the environment. And actually our job is to kind of do the best that we can to aid the coach's delivery. So I've seen it where sports scientists get all disgruntled because the coach isn't listening to the descriptive player minutes or player loadings, and then they take it personally. And same with psych, I've done it where I sat in reviews and I thought they haven't even asked about psych, or they haven't even considered that this could be a psychological concept. And is it me? Am I not delivering my point properly? What is it? And actually providing that we can do the best we can to support the coach. I can empathise on the side of simplicity. I can see it. But probably my kind of underlying thought would be, from a sports psych perspective, is just be aware of what you're doing and why. So if you had no sports psychologists surrounding you, if you had no resources, it would be, as a coach, just to take a moment to reflect and think, why am I manipulating the session? Why am I giving this feedback? How? Timing. And actually, if you stopped and had a true, deep, authentic reflection, you could probably answer some of them questions yourself, which, as a sports psych, I think most people would agree, our job is to never really to tell you what to do, but to make you more aware of what you're doing and why. So that will probably be if we had nothing, it would be, please think about what you do and why. If we had everything, let's get every learning, sports psych, clinical psych, everybody in.
Probably, I suppose, the realistic approach would be somewhere in between, which I think, I don't know about your experience, I think that's starting to happen now, would you say?
Yeah. In the summer we had a meeting at the Premier League around everybody. It wasn't just the Premier League clubs, but it was all of the sports psychs, and it was a really good day. And we kind of outlined who we've got on our team, what their remits are and what their roles are, and listening to what other clubs are doing and how different people are being brought in is really interesting. Definitely more support now, which with more support, and this is again one of the challenges, is defining boundaries of practice. So some things that player care would now maybe take over, maybe sports psych would have done previously. Some things are similar. Then some safeguarding officers do player care as well, and how does psych fit in with safeguarding, especially if you've got different quals, and and again, these are conversations that you need to have. And coming from one club to another, it looks so different. I haven't really changed my calls since I changed clubs, so it's not really my idea of sports psych that has changed, but the organisations and the people that you work with, their roles are just even marginally different, can have a massive impact. So it's really important to kind of identify them roles as we do get more support.
It's very dynamic, isn't it? It's changing all the time.
Absolutely, yeah. If I think back when I started at Burnley, so it was around 2010, I think we were in a hut and there was maybe 3 coaches, me, the academy manager, and a couple of physios. Now, when I left, as I say, there was 26 full-time, full and part-time, just coaches. They built a massive £13 million training ground, and by the time I was leaving there, they'd outgrown that as well. It's just constantly, which is good. But, and again, like I just mentioned previously, the whole term of sports psychiatry now. I knew psychiatry was creeping into sport, but I didn't realise it was a term going to be used. So again, maybe in the last month, I've had some conversations around with 2 different people. What does that look like for them? And it looks different for them.
Yeah, and I think that's where it can become also quite scary in terms of credibility, accreditation, definition. It becomes scary, awkward for clubs in terms of what optimal provision or gold standard provision essentially looks like.
Yeah.
So I think that therein becomes, as the landscape builds, therein becomes the challenge, I suppose.
Well, and again, I don't want to talk about Burnley too much, but when I was leaving, we'd then got another sports psych in who was HCPC or just about to get his HCPC. Brilliant, player facing, loves working with players, a real strong provision, real strong addition for the club. So they didn't want to replace my role or the sports psych and coaching role with the sports psych, because it was a different role. They wanted to go down to somebody more organisational, more around executive coaching, and therefore didn't need to be HCPC because they weren't a sports psychologist or they weren't a psychologist. Now, in an attempt, like you're saying, to make the gold standard and try and put a level of provision that is a benchmark, that then caused a lot of discussions and a lot of conflict between the club, because this is the right type of person that we want for the role, because the role is this, versus what maybe the audit tool was saying. And so then there was discussions in how do they use the budget then? Do they go and get again somebody who's HCPC? Well, actually that might not be the right person to have the types of conversations that we want, just to tick a box. So there was, I know there was, when I was leaving and when I'd left, strong discussions about justifying why we had somebody real stronger to say HCPC in the building. So that tick the box was the question. Can we then go down another route and use the budget in this way? Or not, because they're not HCPC. So like you're saying, yes, I can see why we need the gold standard, and I think it is good, especially for people like me who've taken my development pathway where, like 8-9 years ago, there were so many people doing sports psych, calling themselves sports psychs. I've had so many steep learning curves as well, just using my own language and doing different things, that compared to now, it is really great. More and more players are coming to us they have worked with people, or they pay somebody privately. As a club, we're never going to say stop working with them. That's not my philosophy. If you are having a strong relationship with somebody where you're opening up to somebody and you've got that trust with somebody, just tell me who it is so we can just at least capture what provisions our players are using, and again check regulation. But the flip side, are we almost hanging ourselves by regulation because people are falling through the net because they haven't got it, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. It's an increasingly complex landscape. Jennifer, I loved that conversation. I think we've gone off on so many different pathways there. I think it's brilliant. I know that you're going to spark the interest of people out there who might want to get more information about some of the stuff that we've spoken about, the transformational leadership, the 5 Eyes, Jean Cotte's 5 Eyes, and so on and so forth. So what's your Twitter handle, and if anybody wanted to get in touch, is that the best way? Is there another way to get in touch?
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is Lacey, LACY_Jen. There's an avid picture of me trying to be a long distance runner although lockdown's doing my times quite good, I'm not going to lie. Just send me a message or send me a tweet. I do go on it quite regularly. I may not tweet as often as some people do, but it's normally because I'm spending all my time reading all the other tweets that people are putting out and all the articles that I feel like I'm missing out on. Just give me a tweet or a message.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was awesome. That was a really good conversation. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Well, everyone, wasn't that a brilliant conversation? And I'd love to know what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any ideas, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.